Welcome to Catholic Homeschool Radio, where we begin conversations to help parents enrich their lives and make practical decisions for the future.
Welcome, friends, to Catholic Homeschool Radio. Priscilla McCaffrey here in America's first city, St. Augustine, Florida. St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied European established settlement in the United States. The area was sited on the Feast of St. Augustine, and I admit the accents confuse. It was officially founded on the Feast of Our Lady's birthday, September 8th, 1565. The day was marked by order of founder Pedro Menendez with a Mass, thus giving St. Augustine the beautiful description of the city where the altar is older than the hearth. It's in keeping with the founding of any civilization that it be centered around the divine. That's my little bit. You won't get that in history classes. But the city is located on a spit of land in northeast Florida between the St. Sebastian River and the Intercoastal Waterway. And I'll make a little tourist pitch here. Across the lovely Bridge of Lions is Anastasia Island with fabulous beaches right on the Atlantic that my children have run up and down on for years. They were toddlers, and later one got into, just picked up with a running club once to run a few miles on it. And these are our favorite beaches. And with the scheduling freedom of the homeschooling family, October is my favorite month down here. But there's good reason to come other times of the year, especially between the week before Thanksgiving until the end of January. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And okay, I have to admit, St. Augustine isn't posh like Naples or Palm Beach. It doesn't exude old world elegance like Montreal, except here and there. It doesn't bask in the ambience of Franciscan missionary serenity like the missions in California, but I think it's an interesting place to visit, and there is a fair amount for the family to enjoy and school children to learn. There are lots of heroic characters, lay and religious, martyrs, and probably the coolest fort in North America. And my kids just loved going to that when they were little. With us today is a new friend, Elizabeth Duran Gessner. She has a huge background in art history and languages, and as if she didn't have enough to do, she when she came to St. Augustine, she started getting involved in some really interesting preservation efforts in America's oldest city. Elizabeth, thanks for coming.
Well, it's great to be here, and it's always wonderful to talk about St. Augustine because it's a place I really love, and it is absolutely so stuffed with history that it's hard to figure out where to begin.
Oh, good. Well, we probably, we're going to have to limit ourselves because of the time, but basically, this is an introduction to St. Augustine, and I have always wanted friends and family to come down here, and so we're going to try to point out a few things of interest. There is there's one place here that I know a lot of people have or know about, and I will never go to, and it's Ripley's Believe It or Not.
No,
so to me,
I actually haven't been there either.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Good, okay. That's the place, maybe the husbands out there can take the little boys. I'm sure the little girls are fascinated too, but I just couldn't go there. So that's the ridiculous. We'll move to the sublime. So where should we start if we want to have a focus down here?
Well, if we're focusing on Catholic history, probably the best way to start is by focusing on the sites that are involved. I mean, there are physical kind of things you can see left by all of these, or in some cases, actually, they're reconstructions, but there are a number of important sites here that you can actually make a long day's walk out of, or you can divide over several days. Mm-hmm. And some of them are open all the time and easily accessible. Others, you have to sort of schedule your trip a little to make sure you can go in on the days they're open. The property, of course, belongs to the Diocese of St. Augustine, and some of the properties belong specifically to the cathedral parish. The cathedral is that big, beautiful building on the plaza, the central plaza. Mm-hmm. And that was actually built in 1793. It's undergone a lot of changes since then, mostly because there was a fire in 1887.
Was it rebuilt?
It was the walls remained standing, but the roof and all of the interior furnishings, including the altar, were destroyed, and that is actually one of the reasons we don't have any of this neat 18th century stuff that would have been in there.
I always wondered about that.
Yeah.
And is the cathedral St. Augustine?
Yes.
Okay. And what do the locals say? Is it the Cathedral of St. Augustine or St. Augustine?
Augustine. St. Augustine, yeah.
Everybody says Augustine.
Everybody says Augustine.
Okay.
I mean, when I'm giving tours there or something, I will talk about the saint as St. Augustine.
Yeah.
But actually, I now people just don't understand it. So
Okay.
the town is St. Augustine, and I think of it as the cathedral being the cathedral of this town.
Of the
Like we
town,
might talk
okay.
about the cathedral of, I don't know, Detroit or something like that. But
Right.
the in the cathedral, if you go in there, you will see some wonderful historical murals that were done by an artist named Hugo Olms on the occasion of a renovation in 1965 for the 450th anniversary of the founding of the city of St. Augustine. So this is kind of a neat place to start because you can look at these things and see the major scenes. You know, for example, the first Mass. If you look at the back of the church, there are some large murals back there. And the building of the cathedral, other episodes. And then on the front, on either side of the altar, there are murals depicting things that were happening in Europe. For example, the Council of Trent, that influenced our founding. And then on the other side, there are murals depicting the activities of the Spanish, you know, preaching to the Indians and the St. Augustine's early times as a little fishing village.
Uh-huh.
So
that's kind of interesting that they're mindful of the Council of Trent. Mm-hmm. It's probably the only place in America where there's a mural linking those
yes.
those two things, the founding of America and the Council of Trent. Hadn't put that together myself. Well, what was the relation? Was there any discussion about the New World in the Council of Trent and the treatment of Indians, or was it Native Americans, or?
They were urged to evangelize.
Okay.
And there was much more of an emphasis on that. The Spanish, from the very start, forbade the enslavement of Indians, and this was Queen Isabella, who basically told everybody. In fact, Columbus went to jail for having brought some Indians back to Spain against their will to show them off.
That's why.
So the Spanish really were not setting out to enslave the Indians or to do anything except really basically live here. Mm-hmm. And the missionaries who accompanied them obviously were preaching to the Indians. They did not force them to convert. The missionaries, and that's why you hear these stories of the missionaries in California doing all these dramatic things when they preached. Basically, what they wanted to do was to get the Indians' involvement, their consent to be baptized. Mm-hmm. And they had a long period of catechesis, and they also had a terribly long period when they were baptized, but they weren't quite considered mature Christians
of course,
yet. And
yeah.
The missions here were structured that way. We originally had Jesuits here, and they didn't last very long. You have to realize this was the 16th century, and the Jesuit order was brand new at that point.
Yes.
So several of them were killed immediately upon landing. The Dominicans were here, but they mostly actually concentrated on the Gulf Coast. And they also did not successfully establish any missions.
But the Franciscans did.
Exactly.
That's interesting. That's one for the Franciscans. We should hear more about that. So if there was catechesis, did that also mean that they were writing the language and trying to give them a written language?
Yes, they did. They studied it. We have things that they wrote. They had a lot of lay Indian catechists, and we actually have the little catechisms that they wrote, or the things they had written to help their help the converts, or the less experienced Christians, so to speak. And the missions were arranged. The mission chain was extensive here. If you go to Mission Nombre de Dios, you can see a bronze plaque that shows you the chain of missions, which went all the way up through basically to North Carolina, and then all the way across. It was an L-shaped chain all the way across to Alabama.
Okay, so that, we always know about the Spanish missions in California and Junipero Serra. We have no familiarity with these missions. Are there still standing missions?
No, the difference is ours were, of course, 200 years before the California missions. Those were mostly done in the early 1700s. Ours started in the late 1500s.
Yeah.
So they were built of wood. Stone was not used in construction here until actually the 17th century, end of the 17th century. So they were very perishable. And, of course, there is the fact that they were destroyed by the British colonists in 1702.
Okay, so
there
that's
were
kind of the
huge
key
attacks
thing.
on the missions. And that totally wiped out the chain. The Franciscans did remain here for a while, but then eventually they,
All right, why was a mission a place for attack? Why would they attack the missions?
Because of the Spanish presence. I mean, it was seen as a way of getting rid of the Spanish. The British worked with Indian allies, whom they armed, and who were historically enemies of the Indian groups here, who were mostly Yamasee, Appalachee, and Wali. These are actually language groups, and not really tribes. Within that, there would be sort of tribes or family groupings, but that sort of broadly describes the Florida Indians. The original ones who lived here were Timucuans, but there was a terrible smallpox outbreak, because this is a port city, and so it was bound to happen. And since they had no resistance, most of them died. A few of them did survive, but they weren't the major presence here. So it's very interesting. The British, of course, also hated Catholics. And this massive Catholic presence here was not something they liked. So they really swept through and just did a terrible job on them. There is actually a cause proceeding now for the martyrs of Florida and Georgia.
Okay, that I know about the Georgia. They're called the Georgia Martyrs, but that's being handled out of the St. Augustine Chancery.
No, that is actually, there are two groups. There's the Georgia Martyrs and the Florida Martyrs.
Okay.
And they're actually thinking of joining them together. So it would be the Georgia-Florida Martyrs or the Florida-Georgia Martyrs.
Are these all Franciscan
These
friars?
are all from the Franciscan monasteries. And they're mostly lay people. They're mostly Indians.
They're Indians?
They're mostly, most of the people.
Okay,
The friars who were there, of course, were killed along with some Spanish soldiers, but the great majority of them, and I believe here in Florida there's something like 100 and something in this group, 116 or something. The vice postulator for the cause, Dr. Mary Soha, lives here, so we have a lot of we keep up on this.
Okay, so if a family wanted to come here and pay some tribute to the martyrs, what do they do?
Well, unfortunately, the shrine is actually in Tallahassee because there was a big mission there, San Luis. Probably the most important of the missions was there, and that one was completely destroyed, and it was very gruesome. So the shrine is actually there. We don't have anything here yet, although I think we probably will. The place to start.
Gotta have it. Gotta have it.
Well, the place to start would be Nombre de Dios, which is the mission where the La Leche Chapel is located.
All right, so let's. The mission has one name, and can you tell us in English what that is?
Name of God.
Yeah. All right, which is very beautiful. And then the shrine. Why is there a different name for the shrine? And one name for the mission.
That's right. Well, the mission was founded, of course, when they had the first Mass. That was what they proclaimed the name of the site to be. The mission was established in the town Nombre de Dios. So that was basically the site of there was a small wooden church there. That is now believed to be actually part of the property of the Fountain of Youth, which is an interesting site itself.
It's sort of decrepit. I've been there, and I thought for a Fountain of Youth, it was pretty decrepit. Maybe it's nicer nowadays. That was over 30 years ago.
They've improved it a lot, and they're trying to make it actually a respectable historical and archaeological site.
Are they going to move it back closer to the mission?
No,
what we know as the mission?
these properties are actually contiguously numbered.
Oh,
the mission.
okay.
It doesn't look that way.
No,
but
I
they
didn't
actually
realize
are.
that.
And the original wooden chapel was probably on where actually the Fountain of Youth site is now, and they have built a replica wooden chapel there. But
that is the same size. It's not diminished. It's
No,
the
that's
same
the
size?
same. Yeah, yeah.
All right. I just want to tell people it's this charming little chapel, and it seems like a holy place. It's where you can really pray. It's not just a little touristy replica. It's a very peaceful little spot.
That's the La Leche chapel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the
that's
one?
different. No.
Oh. Okay.
The little chapel they built as a replica for the original Spanish wooden chapel was actually just built by volunteers a couple of years ago. It was built with a lot of research into what the original one would have been like, its size and the specifications. When I say missions, also people think of the California missions, which were compounds with barracks and for single converts and then workshops and things. These weren't. These were basically just Indian villages that were built around a church. The Spanish really didn't interfere with any aspect of the Indians' lives except things that conflicted. For example, some of them practiced polygamy. Well, obviously that could not stay. And they played a particularly vicious kind of war game that resulted in a lot of deaths. So the Spanish, forbade that.
And it was a game.
It was a
among
game,
them,
right?
Among
the
their
young
best
men
friends.
the young men would get together. It was like a competitive game. It was sort of their football, I guess. But it resulted
with
in
tomahawks or something.
Yeah. Basically, it was something that I think where they used it like a stone as a ball or something. So it was and the purpose was actually to either kill each other or severely wound each other. So
do you? I think the name Nuestra.
Señora.
Remedios.
Los Remedios, yes.
And then the devotion to Our Lady of La Leche, was that to introduce some more gentle elements into their culture, or was this?
No, the Nombre de Dios came from the 15th century, basically. In the early to middle 17th century, there was a devotion in Madrid to Our Lady of La Leche. And the full title is Our Lady of La Leche y Buen Parto, which means milk and good childbirth.
I love that.
And the reason for that, actually, the image, probably the original statue may have been from Flanders or something. You notice that the statue is usually blonde. And it was found by a nobleman in Madrid. It was being carried along the street by a drunk, probably a sailor, who had plundered it from Flanders or something like that, because of course the Spanish were up there. And he took it home. His wife was having a difficult delivery, and they put it on the mantelpiece, and she came through her childbirth successfully. So it became a very important devotion in Spain. And of course, in the New World, it became very important because, prayer was about the only thing you had here in terms of medical health.
Right.
And childbirth
no sanitation, hygiene, medical health, you better have prayer.
Exactly. And childbirth was very dangerous for women.
Yeah.
So the devotion was brought here probably very early in the 17th century, in the early 1600s. There was probably a wooden chapel, and then in 1671 or so, a stone chapel was built. And that, if you go to the mission where it is now, the shrine, La Leche, they recently found the stone floor that was under that original stone chapel, and they're doing archaeological investigations.
Okay, so is the chapel still on top of it?
No.
They removed
the chapel
that part
disappeared.
of it?
They forgot about nobody knew where it was for a while.
Okay.
The ruins remained standing for quite some time. But the chapel had sort of, by the 20th century, really, those had gone away. The chapel that is there now, the Little La Leche Chapel, was built. The first one on that particular site was built by our first bishop, Bishop Augustine, who was French. But the devotion, of course, had been going along just fine for many, many years. And interestingly enough, it was actually that chapel that led to the diocese getting title to that property again. Because when Florida became part of the United States, the federal government seized all the church property here, including the cathedral, Tolomado Cemetery, the mission, the Franciscan convent, the barracks. And
And that was about in the 1860s when it was...
we became a state in 1845 and a territory in 1821.
Okay.
And it was in the 1820s that they seized it. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. They claim...
You mean the Catholic Church trying to reclaim its property?
Yes, and because the federal government, the United States government, claimed that this was actually property that belonged to the Spanish crown and therefore was ceded to the U.S. government. And the church said, no, this actually belongs to the Catholic Church. It resulted in the church getting back two of the properties, the cathedral and Tolomato Cemetery, which was the parish cemetery at the time.
And Tolomato Cemetery is where the mission is now?
No, that's another one. That's on Cordova Street. And
okay,
that is a
I've
really
seen
fascinating
that. The little
site with
cemetery,
the Varela Chapel. And,
okay,
yes,
I want to get back to that, but but did they get the other mission site back at the same time?
No, not immediately.
Okay.
At that point, of course, we weren't a diocese until 1870. Our first bishop was Augustine, who was a really remarkable person, a French Sulpician who had taught at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, the first seminary in the United States, for 25 years, and then was made Bishop of Savannah, became Bishop of St. Augustine. He was Vicar of St. Augustine during Reconstruction and Vicar during the Civil War and Bishop during Reconstruction. Remarkable person. He brought the Sisters of St. Joseph here from France to teach the children of the recently emancipated African Americans. So he was definitely somebody who was really involved in the life of the city. And at that point, you could still see some of the ruins of the 17th century La Leche Chapel. Well, Bishop Verreau built a new little chapel up there. Or actually, first he went to the farmer who owned the land, because when the government got it, they didn't have any use for it, our government. So they just sold it to a local landowner. And he used it for grazing cattle. It wasn't very productive or anything, so it was just a place where he grazed his cattle. So the bishop went to him and said, what would it take? How much do you want for this land? And the farmer, who actually was a Protestant, said, well, it's always bothered me to be grazing my cattle on a place where I could see there was a church.
Oh, that's
so
touching.
He sold it to the diocese. He sold it to the bishop for $1.
Oh,
and that is how.
Well, maybe we should enter his cause.
I tell you. So that is how they got that property back. And at that point, then the bishop built the predecessor to the current La Leche Chapel. That one, unfortunately, was destroyed by a hurricane. They built another one in 1914. That one also subsequently was destroyed by a hurricane. And the current one there, I think, dates from 1923 or so. But it is beautiful, and it is, as you say, a site that is just, laden with prayers.
Yes, yeah. And a lot of women will go there because it's dedicated to Our Lady of La Leche. They go there for prayers for their children, for their pregnancies, for safe delivery, and to have children.
Exactly.
So, tons of prayers have been offered up there. I know I did the same thing many years ago.
Yeah.
And I go back now for the same thing for other people I know.
People do, and people make vows, and they'll come back and, they sort of fulfill it by going on pilgrimage to the shrine there, to the mission.
Now, there are graves over there. Those are real graves, right? That's so. When you spoke earlier of the cemetery, were those graves there when the Protestant farmer had his, or is that subsequent?
Yeah, there are a lot of Indian burials actually at the Fountain of Youth, but which were on display, unfortunately, in the 1930s and really until I think the 60s or 70s, and then they were reburied.
What do you mean on display?
Well, they had these skeletons. They had done an open, sort of archaeological investigation, and you could go there and stare down at them. But then they finally decided this was a little
not a good thing.
So, and there may be some Indian burials up at La Leche or Mission Nombre de Dios, but we don't really know that. What happened? The reason for these burials, which are all for a 15-year period from 1884 to about 1898, is that Tolomato Cemetery, which was the site of the Tolomato Indian Mission in the early 18th century, after the destruction of the other missions, the Spanish governor, called all of the surviving Indians to come into St. Augustine where they could be protected by the Spanish military. So there were 5 of these, and possibly more of these things that were called refugee Indian villages, and Tolomato was actually the biggest. And there was a chapel with a 4-story stone bell tower on it. I mean, it was
Really?
a significant, yeah.
Do we have pictures of that?
The bell tower was actually taken down by the Spanish in what we call the Second Spanish period, when they returned after that British occupation, and they were building the cathedral. So the bell tower at that point was taken down by them and used in the building of the cathedral, the current cathedral. So the stones from the wall there, actually some of them are from Tolomato, from the Tolomato mission. And the bell, if you look at the bells in the espadaña, which is kind of a Spanish-style bell tower, bell wall, you will see one very ancient one from, I think, 1678, the big one, and then you will see a little tiny one, which is probably the mission bell from Tolomato.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Where do you think that was cast? Do you think that was brought over from the old world?
Probably. To my knowledge, they didn't cast bells here. I mean, I could be wrong, but they probably brought it from the old world. I know the bigger ones certainly were cast in Europe and Spain.
Now, I've seen this cemetery from the deck of a fun barbecue place in St. Augustine.
Yes.
And it's not, I'm going to say, it's not the most impressive looking historically preserved site, because there's a chain link fence.
Oh, no,
there.
there
Not
isn't.
anymore?
No, we had a fundraising campaign.
Good.
It took me like blood, sweat, and tears, but we got this done.
Oh, good.
So
good.
it has
I
a
have
new
to go
fence.
see
It has a gorgeous gate that was
Okay.
actually given to us by a local iron worker.
Really?
Who designed it in sort of this 18th century Spanish style, made it, hung it, and it is genuine, hand on iron work.
So you do have a
it
beautiful
looks
fence, because it is a
looks
cemetery
fantastic.
and you don't
It
want
looks
people
fantastic.
tramping all over it. But
The cemetery, actually, we is the Tolomato Cemetery Preservation Association, which is a group of which I am the president, and which, we founded, about 10 years ago now, to specifically work on preservation issues at the cemetery. Some of the most important people in Second Spanish period and early U.S. period, Florida in general, and St. Augustine in particular, are buried there. The first pastor of the cathedral, Father Miguel O'Reilly, is buried there. Father Varela, who is proposed for canonization, was buried there in that beautiful little chapel.
now, why is he up for canonization?
He was actually he spent most of his life working among Irish immigrants in New York City, founded 3 parishes, and he was very popular among the Cubans, though, because he wrote a lot
when
about...
he came down here to St.
No, he was actually from Cuba originally.
Oh.
He was brought up here in St. Augustine because his mother died, and his father was a comandante at the fort, at the Castillo.
Okay.
His grandfather.
In the second Spanish...
second Spanish period, yeah.
Okay.
And he was actually the pupil of Father Miguel O'Reilly. When he was 16, he went back to Havana to go study in the seminary there, since, of course, we didn't have one here.
I love it. Miguel O'Reilly.
I know.
That's
well,
beautiful.
he was Irish. He was...
That covers it all. Yeah, we have to help to promote that cause.
Him, definitely. He was... Unfortunately, not that much is known about him personally, just his letters to the governors, and other sort of official stuff.
So he served the people in St. Augustine, or Cubans? Was there
Well, we were actually governed from Cuba for a long time.
Oh, that's right,
But
Havana.
our bishop was in Cuba, and used to come here occasionally. And our, the governors were assigned from Cuba. Although we would have one in Florida, but it was actually sort of like he was connected to Cuba more than Mexico City. Places, for example, to the west of us naturally were more connected with Nueva España, with Mexico City, and governed out of places in Mexico. But we were, really governed out of Cuba. So the Father Varela got very involved when he went back there to study. He got very involved in Cuban politics. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. He wrote a lot about freedom of conscience. He wrote about political liberty, And he eventually got himself elected to the Spanish Cortes, the legislature, which had a 3-year existence during that very brief period after the Napoleonic Wars in Spain. He went off to Spain to take his seat along with 2 other representatives.
How did he get elected?
They wanted to
He was
have
3,000 miles away.
They wanted to have Cuba as not as a colony, but as a province of Spain. This was not an independence movement. This was actually something where it would be like Castilla and Cuba, or some other province in Spain, each with their representatives in the Spanish legislature. Well, unfortunately, the absolute monarch Fernando VII came back into power. And once he was pretty secure in his power, he dissolved the legislature. Oh. Unfortunately, that was just when Father Varela got there. And then the king actually put out a contract on the people who had sent assassins after Father Varela.
So back he comes.
So he went back. He went to New York at that point. He fled. He just got on a ship and ended up in New York. At that point,
from Havana to St. Augustine. Or is it the other way around?
Yeah,
St. Augustine, Havana,
right.
Spain, and New
He
York.
was actually, at that point, he lived here during the Second Spanish period. Florida became a state in 1845, and he died in 1853. So he lived through different periods. However, most of it he did in New York City.
Okay.
Because when he got to New York, then he went to the bishop, who was Bishop Dubois at that point, and said, he got incarnated. He showed him his papers, priest in good standing. So he spent the next 25 years or so working among Irish immigrants on the Lower East Side. He founded 3 parishes. He was originally signed to St. Peter's Church, the little tiny one down there near the World Trade Center.
Yeah, that's quite a man. And then he was buried, or did he come? Did they purposely send him?
No, what happened was that he had maintained his Cuban connections, writing about freedom and publishing. He published a newsletter. He actually published the first bilingual newsletter in the United States, and had a lot of Spanish and Cuban friends in New York City. And also, of course, kept up his work with the Irish. And when he was just completely worn out. He was known for his great holiness of life. He was very, very generous, and he's was always visiting the poor and the sick and working among the poor.
Oh, I love that. What a great example.
Yeah, and it's odd. He learned Gaelic to work with the Irish because this was during the 1840s. When you had Irish people from the west of Ireland, where they didn't even speak English. They were just very poor. So he also, though, is being canonized because he remained a real hero to the Cubans. He came back here finally in 1850 because he was getting, he was not feeling particularly up to his duties anymore. And a lot of times, a place where you've spent your childhood is that special place where you feel you want to go back
At
to,
home.
Yeah. So he actually lived in a little shack on the grounds of the cathedral in the east courtyard. And you can see where there's a statue of him in the courtyard.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And you can actually, that was pretty much where his little shack was. It was like a storage room. There used to be a Catholic school on the site, and that was the book storage room. And he had a little table, a little bed in there, and he lived there for 3 years.
That hasn't been reconstructed.
No.
But you just have a description of it.
This was before the fire that, and when the cathedral, after the fire, when they rebuilt it, and by the way, it was rebuilt by the architect James Renwick, who was the same one who did St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Oh, in
New York.
In Lower New York, or
the current one.
Okay.
And, not old St. Patrick's, but St. Patrick's. And
I didn't know.
that was in 1887. And at that point, they added a transept. It hadn't had a transept before. So the transept extends so far that it takes out, it covers the space. Mm-hmm. Now, the Bishop Estevez, our current bishop, who was born in Cuba and brought here when he was 15 or 16 as a refugee with Operation Peter Pan.
Yes.
Grew up in
that's
Indiana.
a fascinating story. Are there a lot of refugees from that? That's another story, folks. I'm going to talk about that sometime. I have a friend who's Cuban, and I'm going to interview her on that. So
Very
but
interesting.
Was he reunited with his family?
Yes, eventually some of
Okay.
the rest of them were able to come here over the years. And he was in Miami for a while, but now he's been our bishop for about maybe 8 years or so. And somebody from Cuba brought him a statue of La Caridad, which is who is their virgin, La Caridad del Cobre, which is the one with the apparition to the people in a boat, and it's.
I'm not familiar with that. That's why that boat is there. And I mean, isn't there a figure of a boat in the transept chapel? Isn't there a?
Well, there's a statue. This image was brought there, and the interesting thing was when there actually was the Lady Chapel was there to begin with. That was where Hugo Olms painted the statue of Our Lady, surrounded by the mysteries of the Rosary, and the titles of the Virgin in the litany of the Virgin. Really beautiful, beautiful thing. Very simple. It's a triptych that folds, so they keep it folded during certain parts of Lent. But there's a corner of it that was free. So the bishop decided that he would put this image of the Virgin brought from Cuba, he would put it there. And after he did that, he discovered that was actually the place. Underneath it was the place where Father Varela's little hut had
that's
been located.
beautiful.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Yes, so he was very, very happy with that. And you can go.
Somehow
you can see
he just put it, it was calling him
so
to the
exactly.
right place.
So you can see where it was, but you can't actually see anything of it, simply because that site is now occupied by the transept.
All right. It's all too soon, but we have to end this.
Okay.
And but I'm gonna. I don't think you have one site for us to go to if we wanted to sort of make a Catholic pilgrimage to St. Augustine to pull that together. That has to be done.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Okay, so we have to that's what this is about. Just get people, generate interest.
Now, they can go to the Tolomato Cemetery website.
Okay, you're going to have to spell that out.
Okay, so it would be www. Tolomato cemetery, one word, metery.com.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, right, I know everybody misspells it, but so if you go there, you'll find out a lot about the cemetery, but also a bit about the history of St. Augustine too, and some of the personalities, some of the people like Father Miguel O'Reilly, for example.
Yes, and then also Father Hurley, Archbishop Hurley.
Now, he's not buried there.
No, I know, but the little museum has an interesting exhibit of him. Is that permanent? Or
that part of it, I think, actually is permanent. The museum, I should have mentioned that, actually.
Well, I had to give you time. He was a stalwart anti-Nazi and anti-communist
exactly.
as a Vatican diplomat, and he was a man of great courage, and that's also an interesting story. But is he buried?
He is buried at San Lorenzo Cemetery, which is on Highway 1, and basically, to clarify this cemetery problem here, Tolomato Cemetery was the parish cemetery from about 1777, which was actually when the Menorcans arrived. This was still during the British period. And when the Spanish returned in 1783-84, then it became the parish cemetery for what is now the St. Augustine, now the cathedral. And it was closed in 1884 because St. Augustine was subject to outbreaks of yellow fever. Oh. Now remember, nobody knew until 1905 with Dr. Walter Reed how this was spread. So people thought it might be bad air or bad water near cemeteries.
Yes, yeah.
So they closed all of the cemeteries. There weren't that many, but they closed all of the cemeteries in St. Augustine. Tolomato, and there was a Protestant cemetery.
What do you mean you close a cemetery? You build a wall around it?
No, you don't permit any more burials.
Oh, okay.
So at that point,
that was seepage.
Then they
somehow
went up to the mission for 15 years, and that's where the burials at the mission come from.
Okay.
And we have, some of the early sisters of St. Joseph are buried there. The original 6 of the original 8 are buried there, and 2 are buried at Tolomato. We have some of the freedmen who were black citizens who had been, when they read the Emancipation Proclamation here, they had joined the Union Army, and there are veterans markers for them. We have just
Is that at Tolomato?
that's at the number. Well, actually,
that's
we have some at Tolomato too.
Okay.
We have 2 of them at Tolomato, and there's about 10 of them at the Mission. And we have one thing you'll see every type of last name in the universe reflected, because Tolomato, because actually St. Augustine, like any Spanish colonial city, had huge numbers of different people from different places, tons of Irish names. You have the Menorcans, you have, obviously Spanish names as well, and Slovak names. I mean, it's the usual collection that you see in a Catholic cemetery. So in any case, the burials were at the Mission for about 15 years, and then they opened San Lorenzo.
Okay. And what does Tolomato mean? Is that an Indian name?
The name of a place. This group actually fled several times. They fled once from Georgia. This was actually one of the earliest. They were Wali Indians, and this is one of the earliest groups converted by the very, very first priests. I think it was actually, they weren't Franciscans. It may have been a Jesuit actually at that point. And this had to do with polygamy, because the missionaries opposed polygamy. And one group of Indians was very upset about this.
Right.
And
It's
attacked
not
the
that
Christian
they hadn't
Indians.
been told originally, but I think they just found it a little bit too restraining.
Too drastic,
Yeah,
right?
too drastic.
Yeah.
So they had to get rid of the priest.
So-
All right, we have to stop. But thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's so interesting. You all have to go out. You have to check out St. Augustine for yourself and read about some of these great characters. Apologies to our listeners and Elizabeth Duran, Gessner of St. Augustine, Florida. I did not want to end this session. I suppose this just illustrates what we are doing here at Catholic Homeschool Radio, introducing our listeners to a topic of interest that they will have to follow up on. We start the conversation and hope it will continue in your homes. You will want to know more about the Florida and Georgia martyrs, Father Miguel O'Reilly, Father Felix Varela, that's Varela, Bishop Augustine Verot, Verot, Bishop Joseph Patrick Curley, who was in the 20th century, and he had been a Vatican diplomat and true warrior against the Nazis and then the communists, and for a taste of his colorful character, during the Cold War days, he did not want a particular Russian apparatchik coming in and lecturing in his diocese, and he threatened that if this man came, he would have every church in his diocese toll their bell and keep on tolling it. And he won. So Florida has lots of heroic and colorful characters. But for clarity's sake, I will repeat that there is not really a good Catholic history website for people who want to make St. Augustine a sort of pilgrim spot. There are rumblings out of the St. Augustine Diocesan Chancery that suggest the need is felt. We can only hope that something will be done in the near future. I will give you 3 websites which might be useful to you in planning a trip. The first was the one Elizabeth mentioned, tolomatocemetery.com. Tolomato is Tolomato, cemetery, cemetery.com. A second would be missionandshrine.org, one word, of course. The third is thefirstparish.org. The First Parish is one word also. I did mention in my introduction that St. Augustine is especially festive from, about the week before Thanksgiving through the month of January. We didn't get to talk about that, so I'll just fill you in. So that's basically the Christmas season. That's when the first city is lit up with over 2 million lights. It's a beautiful, beautiful reminder of Christ, the light of the world, whose light was first brought from the old world to the new by incredibly brave self-giving Spanish missionaries. I, for one, am also grateful to the commercial parties of downtown St. Augustine who have a financial interest in celebrating Christmas. Without them, we would not have this magnificent display of the city glistening in the waters of the bay. I also like to think about the era in our country's history when Spanish families and native converts first lit up the village walks, carrying their farolitos to, so to speak, light the way for the Holy Family in celebration of the Nativity. And I also feel grateful that the joyful celebration continued in our country from the start of 16th century settlements in Florida, even despite the years when earnest Puritans of the North forbade the celebration of Christmas, even to the extent of outlawing mincemeat pie. St. Augustine, our first city, thank you.